Welcome, everyone, to the HB Global Employee Ownership Podcast Series. We are continuing our mini-series where Bob Whalen, CEO of HB Global, and Stacy Baum, Senior Vice President of People and Culture, will be focused on what it means to scale culture and how the mission, vision, and core values of HB Global play into that, but also where the rubber meets the road, the behaviors that support that, how being an ESOP supports that, and more. Today, specifically, they're going to be focused on the mission and vision of HB Global, striking a balance within the organization, being a people-centric organization, and how we can be great teammates to support the mission and vision. Before we get started, we have just a few housekeeping items. We recognize that this podcast is available to the general public, but we just want to say that the views expressed in it are in the context of HB Global and may not apply to broader audiences. With that, Stacy, take it away.
Thanks, Jamie. Hi, Bob.
Good morning.
Looking forward to a good discussion today about our mission and vision. So, I think this is just a really true glimpse into our foundation of who HB Global is, what matters most. Do you want to start by sharing what our mission is?
Yeah, our mission is to empower our employee owners to create a great place to work and value. And so I really think it's twofold. And it also, I think one thing that we don't talk about as much is the first part of it, which is empower our employee owners. And so our employee owners are going to make HB Global what it is. And I think that's a really important part. And then I think, we embrace the power of and. We think, there are lots of times there are things that seem that can be working against each other. And we really believe that, creating a great place to work reinforces value creation and not deteriorates from it. So it's really important to us that we're doing both of those things, that we embrace that we're doing both. We're trying to make this a great place to work. And at the same time, we're creating value for our employee owners. And we think that that's a really important part of what we're doing as well.
I think, the other piece of just being a great place to work is we have happy employees. And I think that happiness, we've noticed and encouraged curiosity and some freedom to be creative in some of their choices and how they execute. So I think that overall, the mission is just really a great summary of who we are and how we view our people centric organization.
Stacy, I think you make a really important point, and hopefully, all of us that work for HB Global, we have a lot of days where that just comes natural.
Yeah.
We are happy. We just rolled out of bed that way on that day. But I think it's also important to recognize we're not all going to be at our best every day. And I still think it's important, while we work to, really put our best foot forward from an attitude perspective. And some days, that's about just working really hard, to be happy. It's a choice we make to a degree. And again, everybody's different and, how you wake up that day. But I think it's really important, that part of what we bring to work is a positive attitude. And, that will lead to better results. And, we can, I've had days where, I woke up and, not in the best frame of mind, but if we say the right things and if we do the right things, we really work ourselves into that attitude that we want to show the world every day. And I think that that's a really important part of who we are as a company and what we're trying to do.
I agree. I think it's also about that scalability piece. So when we talk about, our employee owners, being empowered to make it a great place to work and create value, it really goes back to the heart of our mindset of scalability. So we want to be a growth organization. We don't want to create bottlenecks. We want to create good teams, good partnership, and be able to scale, whether it's project to project or the organization as a whole.
Yeah, I think that that's a really important part. of what we're trying to do. And this year, we're going to focus even more on scaling our culture and the importance of, scaling our culture, because we really are getting to a size and breadth where, it comes naturally for me to want to see, everybody have the as much autonomy as they can possibly have in doing that work. I think it's really important to our satisfaction in our job, and so that comes naturally. But it also helps us to scale the things that are important to us. And I think our mission, vision, core values, our principles are all aspects of our culture, and we're trying to scale that culture. And the more that that actually gets ingrained to who we are as a business, as divisions, our companies, our teams, the more it is just how we operate. And so I think that that's a really important thing. And the other thing, I would say, I think it's important for people to know what we're about. We want to attract people that want what we want. We're not trying to attract those employees that are trying to do as little as they can possibly do to collect their paycheck. That's not the group we are. That's not what we're interested in. We're not just interested in getting along. We're not interested in being the same as a business, tomorrow as we were today. We're trying to get a little bit better all the time. And so I think articulating all those things is really important to attracting, employee owners that want the same things we want. We're going to be a lot more successful if we start out, with a group of employee owners that want what we want. And that's why I think it's so important that we talk about it, and articulate it so everybody knows.
Really great points, Bob. I I think the other piece that we haven't necessarily touched on yet is the vision. So do you want to share our vision wheel for how we view the organization?
Yes. So I think there's three, as you look at a business, there's three ways that businesses focus. Uh, the first one I actually think leads to the worst results. And that's a business that's focused on the financial results all the time. So, like, everything's focused on the financial results of the business. Every second of the day is focused there. And I don't think that that leads to the best, financial results. That leads to a company that's more likely to be focused on the short term as opposed to the long term. Then there's a second, which I think is a very viable way to go about doing business, but is the focus first and really only on the customer. So you have this maniacal focus, on the customer, and I think, that's been, best articulated by what Amazon has done over the last 25 years. And as you can see, it's a model that can lead to great success. We take the third way of approaching, going after business, or going, working in our business, to being focused on our employees first. And so our focus, and at the top of, our visual of our vision, is that we're looking for engaged employee owners. So we're looking for engaged employees. And when we have engaged employees, they will produce raving fans of our customers. So it's that environment of employees that are truly engaged that leads to creating raving fans of customers. And when we produce those raving fans of customers, that will produce financial results. But the focus is not really there. It's an outcome of the other things that we've done. And because we're employee owned, those superior financial results get reinvested back into our employees through a number of ways, whether it be reinvesting in the business for the tools and the education that we need, or whether it be through the bonuses that we share what we create with our employees at the end of every year, or whether it be the ESOP value that we produce, which is a lot of our focus because, we're so focused on, what we do over the long run. But it's a self-reinforcing cycle. And you can get too focused and, any area, even in our business model. If we have an employee owner that believes, what they want at that second is more important than what the customer needs or wants, that can really lead to, some bad behavior. So it's really about balancing, these things out to get the best out of your company. But I believe it starts with engaged employees. And when you have engaged employees, you're going to be successful as a business.
Thanks for that, Bob. I think, the comment around finding a balance, that engaged employees are foundation, but being able to have a language and talk about that balance and hold each other accountable, I think that's a really key part of that vision wheel that is balanced and continues to move.
And Stacy, I think it's like any relationship. We have relationships with our spouse, with our friends, with our children. It really is being able to communicate, uh, wh- first of all, when things are right, you want to show gratitude, and you want to make sure you take the time to show those in our relationships that we appreciate, what they've done, and we value, them as individuals. But I think we also have to have a language when things aren't right, when we want to see them different, and the more that we can approach that in a productive way, have a language that we use, uh, to communicate those differences, the more likely we are to find a common ground. I think it's really important, that we have this mission, vision, core values, our principles, so that we can talk about them, so we can highlight it, and we can say this doesn't, fit this.
Bob, I think we've touched on this before. I know you've mentioned it a couple of times. What's your view on the mission, vision, core values, principles being aspirational versus, are we perfect today and executing every day?
Yeah, I've talked about it in the past on the podcast, but sports influenced me a lot, growing up. And so I had a great high school coach. He was both my football coach and my wrestling coach. But he would always downplay the team. No matter what the situation, he was always downplaying the team, and was really trying to stay under the radar. And then I went and wrestled in college, and I had a college coach that was right out there with what we were trying to achieve. We were trying, to be in the top 10 in the country, and, win the Ivy League championship, and, place, in the top 10 in the country, and produce All Americans. And that at the time he started doing it was really aspirational, but it set the tone for what he was doing. And that's really, as I view what we are as our culture as a business, um, I realize it's not what we say we are that's most important. It's our behaviors and what we actually do. And I realize that what we say is not 100% how we act, all 2,000 of our employee owners every day and every decision. But I think it's really important that we say what we aspire to be, that we give ourselves a language to talk about that, to talk about, when people think we're falling short, so we can constantly be striving. I don't believe we'll ever get there. I don't believe that we'll ever have 2,000 employee owners that in every situation, that will do the things that are aligned with the culture that we articulate. But I believe the more we talk about it, the more it's part of our everyday conversation, the more our behaviors will align with it, and we'll bridge that gap, and we'll be better and better each day. We'll get a little bit better each day. And so I think that that's an important, piece of what we're trying to do with our culture. Because I think it's impossible. It's impossible. We all fail. There's times in, all of our lives where we don't do, exactly what we aspire to do. But we've got to give ourselves grace. We got to give our teammates grace, and we got to come back the next day, and really look to achieve, what we aspirationally aspire to.
I think there's also that piece, Bob, in our organization of extending grace to others and being committed to supporting each other. So that support isn't a one size fits all. It definitely is something that grows and evolves. And in some instances, our peers and leaders are pushing because they see something in another individual that they think they want to unlock and give them a challenge. In other ways, it's about extending grace and understanding. So, can you speak a little bit about that mindset of how we can be better teammates to each other and support our mission?
Well, I think all of those things are true. I think there's a time for pushing hard, uh, and really looking to get more out of somebody, whether it be you or me or anybody there. There is a time and a place, for somebody to push us and really, think we can do better. And then I think there's another time, where somebody has fallen short, hasn't lived up to what we're trying to do, and maybe the best reaction to that is grace. And I will say, when you do those two things, first of all, is very difficult. And secondly, we won't get it 100% right. There will be a time, where folks think we've got to be holding, people on our team more accountable. So in essence, arguing that we've got to be, more direct and push our team harder. And then there's other times, where folks, think that we're, so maniacally focused on something, that we're not giving a teammate the grace that they need at the time. And we will, for certain, not always get that right. And I think we're trying to balance that. You're trying to find that. I know for me, uh, the times that I push the team the hardest tend to be when things are going the best. I think people are in a better position to respond to criticism when things are going well. And it's when the business is really going through its toughest times that I have a tendency to be more of a cheerleader, than I am a critic of what's going on. But do I get that right? Absolutely not. I am like, everybody else. I don't get that balance right at, all the time. And our other leaders, don't either. We're not going to be perfect. But I think it's, those are good places to start of what we're trying to do, and to be really thoughtful about, when we use those tools for our organization. I know when I'm most critical of myself is when it's not driven by a conscious decision of I was either, trying to push the team harder or to give some people some grace because I think they needed it at that time. I think the times I'm most critical of myself, it's when, I lose my temper. I lose my temper and am on the pushing side of the equation, that I'm most critical, because it wasn't because I made a conscious decision that was the best tactic for the time. It was because I lost my temper. Or vice versa, whenever you don't hold somebody accountable because you're more worried about being liked or how the person's going to respond to you, or that's not good either. There's times where people need to hear the truth, even if it's hard for you to deliver, even if it's hard to have that critical conversation. And so most critical on myself and most critical on my team when I think it's not the result for why we pick one or the other. It's our own, emotions that are driving us to do that may not be productive for the team.
I think those are all great examples. Bob, I've really enjoyed the conversation today. I hope our listeners did as well around our mission and vision and just what makes us special as HB Global and being a people centric organization. So thank you for the time and discussion today.
Thanks, Stacy.
Thanks, guys. Be sure to check out Bob's new book, Beyond Your Ownership, being released March 31st, 2026. If you have questions for Bob, we'd love to hear them and answer them in future podcasts. Feel free to submit them to eopodcast@hb-global.com, and we'll see you next time.